Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Today, the talk is called Fundamental Education. I'm going to share the screen. I'll share my presentation. Hopefully, you can see something. Let's begin. So, fundamental education. Generally, in these times, we find that education in itself, which is not something we just receive at kindergarten or school or university or college. We're talking about something which we gain throughout our entire life. That education is generally mechanical because we find that it's related to a lot of dogmas. It's all about people passing exams in a mechanical way because if we refer to previous lectures, we understand that the majority of humanity is psychologically asleep. And this means that students, whether they're school children, college graduates, university students of some type, they are all learning, we can say more or less, a verbose perpetuality. And the reason that the system, in this case, the education system, is doing that is to teach people so that they are able later in their life to get a job, to get a career, to get security, maybe ultimately to gain that level of attractiveness so that they can be married off and put into a particular segment or portion or place within society. And they are taught through lists in a very subjective way. And those topics in those lists are often based on fears, based on subjectiveness of the system and of the people who give those teachings. And we're going to come on to that or this in more detail later. So, in essence, what is happening is that the educational system is creating mechanical creatures, and so much so that they go on, as you just mentioned, to form or take a particular place in society in a mechanical way. On the other side of the coin, it could be said that fundamental education should be more about awakening consciousness, about being able to educate the person so that they are able to find the objective realities of the life in which they're leading. So they're able to find wisdom rather than repeating a lot of subjective data, which they often forget very soon afterwards. Excuse me. So if we are able to awaken consciousness and allow that light to enter into our psychological country, we'll be taking a step forward in the fundamental education, which obviously relates to the awakening of the consciousness, which you've talked about many times before. So, what is precisely fundamental education? Fundamental education in itself is very practical. It is, you can say, the science of consciousness. It relates to or gives us information about the relationships we have with others, other people, nature, and of course ourselves. And that means that fundamental education gives the student guidelines for self-examination. It can be given in a wise way, in other words, wisdom permeating between teachers or parents and those people who are being educated. We can say youngsters, but actually we mean anybody in their entire life. So fundamental education is learning how to live our lives. And we can say, therefore, that fundamental education gives us or leads us to true gnosis. And only from the fundamental education do the teachings of Gnosis begin to unfold or manifest. So it's a circular relationship between that which is fundamental education and Gnosis. But of course, we need to think about the way in which we balance our education, our life, in terms of discipline as a beginning. Normally, it's the case nowadays in many places that students behave in certain ways because they are taught discipline. Discipline to overcome this or that temptation, whether it's talking in the classroom or being lazy with their homework or developing a discipline which gives them or makes them into, in inverted commas, ideal students. And that discipline comes as a threat, whether it be a punishment or some kind of imposition, which the student or child will not necessarily understand. So through the threat of punishment, discipline is instilled within the person. And that's not very conscious, that's quite a mechanical relationship. The system imposes norms, and those norms are built around the control through the discipline of the children or the student. And you can say, well, that then goes on to the rest of our life because we are given disciplinary decisions or manifestations in our society. For example, parking in a car park space and we overrun, we get a car park fine. So we've been disciplined for that. Or we may be uh, in a queue somewhere, we push in and a policeman comes and disciplines us for something. Not very good examples, but you can see where I'm coming from. However, fundamental education teaches conciliation with freedom, because order without freedom leads to tyranny, and freedom without order leads to anarchy. And this therefore becomes the basis of fundamental education, because what we're trying to do in that fundamental education is create a balance between freedom and order. And we'll come on to that freedom and order later in the discussion. We know from previous lectures that we need to develop our own internal discipline when it comes to, for example, practices like the key soul, self-remembrance, the psychological death. We need to be able to apply a certain form of discipline which comes from inside. It comes from our own essence. It comes from the very core of who we are, because we want to do that work, that inner work. And external imposed disciplines are therefore unnecessary for fundamental education. Discipline is not something which teaches the consciousness. In fact, discipline, we can say ultimately, is a prison for the mind because it controls in a mechanical way. And when we talk about the mind, we can move on to the next part, which is, in terms of fundamental education, how to think consciously. Now, more or less in most educational institutions and in many places within our life, people are taught what to think through dictations, demands, theories, prejudices, ideas, concepts, rather than how to think. In fundamental education, we are given the keys to be able to learn how to think. We need, in this process, therefore, to understand, analyze, and we need to then take these things or any particular issue to meditation. So the understanding can become comprehension. We need to investigate and inquire about any particular topic or analysis before we accept it. We need to experiment because in this way, thinking consciously, we come to and arrive at wisdom. What often happens nowadays is that teachers have criteria which they must perform. They must get a certain amount of topics or a certain amount of topics to the particular students or a certain amount of levels of scores in their exams to enable or to give credence to that particular teacher or school. And so the teachers force prejudices or methods onto children and then later in life onto adults. They force preconceptions which then make the children or the young adults or even the older adults learn like machines because they are psychologically asleep. And this in turn leads to the fact that in this way of learning, as it is in common schools and educational institutions in these times, that the students or the young adults are taught through fear. They are frightened about not having money in their later years, frightened about the status they will be in, frightened about the security they may have in the future. But also that same fear penetrates into the classroom because often is the case that there's a lot of fear between pupils, between students or young adults, peer pressure, ridicule. Then there's what the teachers may offer in response: detention, fear of being caught up in something which may be embarrassing to that child or to that young adult. The kids or the children then therefore act in a sleepy, mechanical way, and the teachers force their dogmas onto the children. And one of those may be the fear of error. This removes free initiative. When there is fear, there cannot be free initiative. But the children, those who are being educated, need to be spontaneous and creative and therefore conscious in those moments so that they are able to have free initiative to question, to ask, to analyze, to meditate. You can even say, healthy criticism, because with the liberation from fear, the freedom of analysis, discussion, and then ultimately meditation leads the person in a conscious path to wisdom. Fear of failure is a very strong aspect of what students encounter in their daily life, in the school, in their educational environment. They have a fear which makes them yearn for maybe a false security. They need their family, their money, their traditions, their security. But if they don't get the right education, then they won't necessarily be able to have those things. And that leads into the right fashions, the right customs, even the right vices. Okay. Fear of what other people will say. These things are very mechanical, very unconscious, very sleepy, and people are not revolutionary. They hang on to and cling to the norms of the system. There's no revolutionary aspects. There's no conscious aspects to the way in which they are learning. And talking about learning, we need to be able to listen consciously. Fundamental education gives us the tools to listen consciously. If we take the word listen, we can see that is an anagram of the word silent. We need to learn how to listen. Many people speak, very few actually listen. They may hear, but do they listen? In other words, we need to listen with our consciousness active. We generally, as a humanity, when we listen to other people, whether it's in a video or on the telephone or even face to face, as that sound of their voice enters our mind, we have within us an internal secretary who translates those words, or rather alters or skews the meaning of those words which we've heard, and converts them into prejudices, concepts, ideas, subjectivity, because what is happening is inside our mind. An ego is acting, manifesting through our false personality, which you'll remember from one of the very first talks in this course. And we perceive what we have heard through the ego that is manifesting in our mind, in our thoughts, in those moments. So we are identified and fascinated with any particular ego. So if someone is talking to us and telling us off, for example, you have been very naughty because you've done X, Y, Z, we might be thinking, why is it always me? It's always me who gets told off. Or this person's very nasty, very angry to me all the time. It's not my fault. We have egos acting as a secretary, hearing the words and converting them into an inner conversation within our own mind. So we are hearing via the earmuffs of the ego, which is manifesting in that moment. Instead, we must listen. And to listen, with a capital L, we need to be in the moment. We need to refine ourselves so that we are able to make the most of every moment through our senses, our behavior, our thoughts, and our feelings. And fundamental education gives us the tools, teaches us how to listen and live in this way. In other words, wisely. We must listen with an alert, spontaneous mind rather than a reactive, mechanical mind. And this takes us to the next part of the topic, which is self-realization. You remember from one of the first lectures, self-realization is ultimately where we, as students of Gnosis, want to go. Self-realization is a way of saying that we are permanently connected to our inner God or our inner being through the elimination of ego, excuse me, through the management of our energy and through the sacrifice for humanity. So through the three factors of the revolution of the consciousness, we are able to reach self-realization. And that in itself is a psychological rebellion. Fundamental education teaches us how to eliminate the ego, which we already have heard about in previous lectures. And in that way, we create within us a permanent center of gravity around the elimination of our or of the egos which are inside our psychology. And in this way, fundamental education creates conscious men and women. Fundamental education is a science which allows the awakening of the consciousness to receive intelligence directly, to discover values through the death of the ego, through the management of energy and through the sacrifice, and to move away from our state of sleepiness. We need to awaken that consciousness. Fundamental education is understanding one's individuality, to profoundly know who we are. You could therefore argue that schooling, in inverted commas, is secondary. Well, we need to live in the systems. We need to live in the systems in which we find ourselves here and now. So rather than existing in our life, we need to live our life with the capital L, live. Okay. And you could say, therefore, we are still going to live the same life as we would have before in terms of the schooling, but now we're going to have an awakened consciousness as we receive that schooling. And then fundamental education gives us the priority to know ourselves. We can also see that technology and the educational aspects of technology don't actually solve anything, because they are quite superficial in terms of the consciousness, in terms of awakening ourselves, in terms of finding this fundamental education. If we start to look at our life and we see that we and many other people are going through a lot of pain inside, and to escape this pain and suffering, we must know ourselves. So the psychological death, the birth, and the sacrifice gives us the methodology we need to know ourselves. Fundamental education helps us to experience life, helps us to listen to what other people say, helps us to think and behave in a more conscious way through direct experience. Okay, so how does this fit into education, as we've just mentioned, the education systems that we have at the moment? Well, not the Gnostic masters tell us, Master Samael in particular, that parents and teachers should start to know themselves. If they start to apply their own fundamental education to themselves, start to awaken their own consciousness and apply those three factors, then what they teach will become more relevant to those children, to those young adults, and to any other people during their whole life. Because rather than receiving reactionary, retarded, you could say, ideas through the sleep of the teachers and the parents, instead, the children receive a conscious, vibrant, active, dynamic way or learning through fundamental education. That means that parents and teachers need to re-educate themselves. It could be said that they are stuck in their own theories which they learned in the educational system, which is to be expected. But now they should teach how to think, not what to think. And obviously, parents can do the same. Parents can do the same at home. How the children behave, how the youth, the young adults, the adolescents behave at home is very much how the child or the children react to the criteria, or you could even say the old criteria of the parents via or through their own particular egos. We should therefore teach children, young adults, youth, etc., how to know themselves, how to find that which is called love, etc., etc. And what does that mean? It means that through fundamental education, the person learns how to think, how to awaken consciousness, how to live our lives as a foundation or a fundamental aspect of the application of education. We learn how to examine our lives and experience directly so that we can practically apply our own gnosis to find the truth. And that gnosis is lifelong. Fundamental education impacts all of us, all of our life. So in terms of the preborn child, the pregnant woman can contemplate beauty or paintings or the countryside, Mother Nature, classical music, etc., because all of those things positively impact the psyche and the development of the child in those first 9 months. And then when the child is born, obviously, the family environment will have direct impacts on the development of the personality and the characteristics of the children and how they learn, how they educate or get educated in those moments. So, for example, for the essence, those children could receive sweet music, classical music, beautiful music as a nourishment for that essence, and at the same time, for the personality, the development of the child will be greatly improved with good examples from the elders, from the siblings, the older siblings. So in a normal family situation, the parents represent wisdom and love. The wisdom is of the father and the love is of the mother. Obviously they can swap, but it needs to be done in a balanced way. Then we come to the adolescent stage. And in that stage, obviously the young person has a lot of sexual energy. And in those moments and times, the teachers and parents should point out the sexual mysteries and advise the child or the young person about how misuse of those sexual energies can lead to degeneration, but through application of the three factors leads to regeneration. Then we come to the youth, the stage of the youth, and that youth, all they want is pleasures. They want to evade any responsibilities. For example, getting married. There's a lot of peer pressure amongst the youth not to be married, as an example. They evade marriage because of fear, because of peer pressure. And generally, the youth don't apply very much psychological death. Okay. They instead tend to fall or follow into vices. For example, they become rascals or sarcastic or lustful. But through the application of fundamental education to the youth, the person is able to transform themselves rather than following their ambitions. They are able to awaken consciousness. Then we enter the stage of maturity, and a mature person should be at that point, especially a Gnostic student, applying the orientations and guidance of fundamental education to themselves and teaching those same things to others, the young, obviously. The parents and the teachers must guide the children with purpose of improving their world, developing their spiritual reality. And then finally, we come to old age. And we know that the masters tell us that applying the psychological death enables the person to get to a very good old age. We all fear old age, but it comes to us all in the end, obviously. And we can say that an older person is a reflection, in a way, of their own inner being. And therefore, we must respect and love the older generations as a reflection of the inner mother and inner father within them. So as you can see, all of these aspects can be linked together to form this fundamental education. Okay, so hopefully you understood that okay. I'm going to move on now to a different topic, which is that called the runes. You know this is the three factors of the revolution of the consciousness, which we talked about earlier, and we will talk about again. And the fact that we need to awaken consciousness. Okay, the rune Fa. So we've all heard of runes, and we tend to think that runes originated in the Northern European Nordic schools, religions, and societies. But actually, the runes began or started in ancient Egyptian schools. And this rune here, drawn on the left, is called the rune Fa. And you may well have seen ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics when you see people holding their arms up in this manner in the temples. You may have either been to Egypt or you might have seen pictures. So runes are an alphabet or series of symbols which, as well as written, can be made with the physical body, the shape with the physical body. And we can do a work with the rune Fa, which is related to the awakening of the consciousness. The runes in themselves harmonize our body and help us draw cosmic energy into our body. It enables us to use the energy to influence our microcosm. It helps us, in this case, to awaken consciousness. So as you can see, the person is facing east. and heels together, the arms straight or straight as possible. Left is slightly higher than the right, and the palms are up like this. We raise the arms in an attitude of adoration, and we do this practice at dawn. It can be done any time of day, but dawn is the best time. And we imagine cosmic energy entering into the body through the palms of the hands, through the fingers, and then the whole body, even entering into our brain. Okay. And this therefore requires concentration. So we may close our eyes in this practice, but for the moment, keep your eyes open because you need to be able to read what's on the screen. As you can see, we start with the petition. Marvelous forces of love, revive my sacred fires so that my consciousness awakens. We say that aloud, and then we pronounce the mantralization or the vocalizations you can see here. Now, on the right-hand side, I've got the kind of like the English way of saying the pronunciation of those 5 vocalizations. Fa, fe, fi, fo, fu. Excuse me. It's important to remember that with this practice, it's a hard F. Ba, like that. So we pronounce the petition in the yellow box, and then we pronounce the vocalization, those 5, and then we repeat the whole thing 3 times, minimum 3 times. If you can do more, that's fine. Maybe you could do it 7 times. Okay, so I'm going to run through it once so you get the gist of it, but you need to do this at dawn. You can do it outside, preferably, but if it's raining, then you can do it inside, no problem. The key is to face east. So we say, with our arms up, marvelous forces of love, revive my sacred fires so that my consciousness awakens. Ba. Fe. Be. Fo. Foo. Now we repeat that 3 times. That is the rune Fa, which is the method or one of the methods to help us awaken consciousness. And it's recommended that you practice this every day if you can, at least once a day, but you can do it as many times as you want. But the key is to face east and to be in concentration. Concentration is the key. So that's the rune Fa. We're going to go back to something we touched on a few weeks ago. This thing called astral projection. So every one of us dreams. When we go to sleep physically, our psychology continues to manifest. We continue to think and have thoughts. And those thinking thoughts, if you will, are what produce within us the dreams. If we are conscious of those situations, we will be having something which is called either surreal dreams, lucid dreams, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, etc., etc. But astral projection is the general name for a particular type of dream. In other words, when we are conscious of the fact that we are in the astral world, the sleep world. We know we are physically asleep, but we also have our consciousness, or rather our psychology, awake in those moments. And therefore, Peter Pan and Wendy is a good example. You could say Mary Poppins. You could say many other classical and current children's stories are all about the astral, being in the astral world. So, what does that mean? It means that through millennia, we as a humanity have known about and have understood astral projection and the fact that we have an astral body. So the Egyptians, as you can see, called it Ba, B-A, the astral double. The ancient Greeks called it Pegasus. You can see there Pegasus is being ridden by Perseus. He's got the head of Medusa. And I'm sure you've all heard of that particular Greek legend or myth. So, what does this mean to us? Astral projection. If you remember, normally when we go to bed or when we want to go to sleep, we need to, first of all, relax. And when we say we need to relax, we're not talking about when if we're so exhausted, so tired out because we've had a really busy day that we just lay down and just go straight to sleep. That is not the relaxation we're talking about. We're talking about consciously relaxing the physical body in a sequential order, as we have done in many of the practices previously on this course, and to relax in a conscious way the physical body. Okay. The other option, if we are very, very nervous, or we have been using our mind a lot during the day, we have many thoughts rushing through our mind. It's very difficult to fall asleep. Our mind is whirring. Well, that relaxation practice that we have done many times in a conscious way helps us to control that whirring mind, so we can calm the mind and we can start to relax the physical body and the mind. And then the next step of this practice is to focus. We're going to focus our attention. And when we say we're going to focus, we'd say we, the essence, the free essence, if you remember from previous talks, the free consciousness we have in our psychology is the bit that's going to do the practice. That's the bit that does the practice, the focus. And as we've heard before, we then concentrate on one thing. In this case, the concentration is on the heart, but it could be on anything, a favorite place or whatever we feel comfortable with. But the heart is recommended because it doesn't need turning off. It's just there. We can just fall asleep without having to worry about doing something about the heart. It's not like a musical thing or anything else which needs us to move again. We're trying to remain still in this concentration, and therefore we don't need anything more than the heart. So at this point, we are psychologically awake and physically awake. Yeah, because we're concentrated. This is known as the state of vigil. You may well have heard that state. And as we we move towards falling asleep physically, we need to remain in that concentrated state. The concentration on that one thing is what we need. This is not forcing our mind. It is allowing our mind to concentrate just on one thing, in this case, the heart. And then we come to that transition, which you can see. That is the transition between being psychologically awake and physically awake to being psychologically asleep psychologically awake and physically asleep. Okay, that transition, if we're able to remain conscious in that process, if we're able to remain concentrated on one thing in that process, then we will become aware, and we will know that we are physically asleep and psychologically awake. Some people can look down and see their physical body asleep. They are able to perceive and understand that they are in the astral world at this point. If we do this practice and we don't see ourselves separate from our physical body, that's no problem, because it's quite likely that later in the night, during our sleep, physical sleep, we will wake up psychologically during our dream time. In our dreams, we'll wake up to the fact that we are in those dreams. Okay, so what does this mean? It means, for example, that we can fly. In the astral world, we're able to fly because there's no gravity. So that's fine. And in that place, when we're consciously aware that we are in the astral domain, we can ask our Divine Mother to help us to go wherever we want to go. Or we can turn it around the other way and say, my Divine Mother, take me where I need to be. And she will take us to a place, maybe to receive a teaching, to receive an experience directly related to our own psychological work or condition, or our own level of being. So one other thing to add is we've already talked about vocalizations and mantra, and there are a number of vocalizations and mantra we can use to assist us in this transition. So rather than focusing on the heart in this concentration on the left-hand side of the transition, instead we focus and then concentrate on a mantra. And that mantra is, in this case, Fa Ra On. Okay? And it's pronounced with a hard F again and a trilled R. So it's Ba Ra On. We pronounce that aloud a minimum 7 times. If we can't pronounce it aloud because we wake other people up or the neighbor will bang on the wall, then we need to pronounce it internally. Okay? Fa Ra On. As you can see, between the Fa and the Ra, there is a breath, and between the Ra and the On, there is a breath. So it's Fa Ra On, etc. Okay? And at the same time, you can imagine the pyramids, as you can see in the image. So this mantra, as we pronounce it, we need to focus on the sound of the mantra that we make. So we are not trying to mentally think about things. We're just listening to the sound, the way in which it vibrates within us as we're doing the mantra. Okay? We're listening to the sound Fa Ra On. And we keep listening as we go through the transition. So we pronounce it 7 times aloud, and then we quiet and then internalize the mantra as we go through the transition at the same rate, the same pace. Fa Ra On, whatever. As we go through that transition, we remain concentrated on the sound of the mantra as we go through the transition. So our physical body will then fall asleep, and psychologically we will be aware that we are in the astral world. Okay, thank you all very much. And that's the end of the video.